So, I've been meaning to say this for a little while, but conservatives are just boring. Among everything else, along with every other criticism you can make of them, they're just freaking boring, man. Like earlier today, I made a brief post on Blue Sky, which if you're not on Blue Sky, you should get there and follow me. Go do it right now. It's actually a pretty nice place, at least for the time being. But I made a point about how back in the day, uh, quote, conservative fiction, and by that I mean, I'm mostly talking about books, but it applies to other stuff too. I mean, genres of fiction that are largely conservative, not just written by conservative authors, but also largely consumed by audiences who have similar political leanings to the authors, and generally push a message that the audience and the author all agrees with. And I'm talking about like old political thrillers, like stuff Tom Clancy used to write, or a lot of military science fiction, or just science fiction in general, would fit into this. And back in the day, those used to be pretty good. Like, you can see the decay in quality of those almost follows the decay of conservatism as an ideology. Like, there's just no intellectual basis for it anymore, even if there used to be. Because back in the 80s, again, you look at political thrillers written by people like Tom Clancy, who were the villains? Well, a lot of times they were spies or military officers from the Soviet Union. And they were they were the villains, but they were patriotic, they were professional, they were good at what they did, and they were very similar to the heroes in a lot of cases, and you got the feeling that in a different life they could have been friends. If you ever read The Hunt for Red October, which you should because it's a really good book, this is the case for pretty much all the antagonists in that book. They are not necessarily good people, but neither are the heroes, and the book has a lot of tangents about how awful the Soviet system is, but for the most part, those are, factual. Not all of them. There are one or two moments where I was reading where I was like, Mr. Clancy, what the hell are you talking about? But overall, generally intelligent stuff back then. And then in the 90s, the Soviet Union collapsed, and so they needed new villains. And they didn't settle on just one, but they settled on a couple of different ones. This is when heroes were fighting drug lords. Occasionally they fought Islamic terrorists, but that wasn't really on their mind until later. And a lot of times they fought Russian revanchists. Like, it's not a book, but if you've ever seen the movie Air Force One with Harrison Ford and Gary Oldman, the villains in that movie are Russian revanchists who are mad about the collapse of the Soviet Union and trying to restore the old glory that they feel was lost from them. And these guys were generally a lot less sympathetic than the villains in the 80s, but they were still fully fleshed out, fully realized characters who, had personalities, and they had belief systems that differed from the authors and probably differed from the audiences as well. But whatever you thought about them, however you felt about them, they were people. They were bad people, but they were people. And in both the 80s and the 90s, a lot of the heroes were, intelligent people. You had people like Jack Ryan, again from Tom Clancy books, who he was an intelligence analyst at the CIA. Like, he wasn't some special forces guy who knew how to go out and fight an entire army by himself. He was a desk jockey who got in over his head, and he managed to think his way out of most situations. Like, he was not opposed to getting into scuffles with people now and again, but he, for the most part, was a smart guy who thought his way out of trouble. And then you hit the aughts, and shit just goes completely downhill from there. Because pretty much always, at this point, the villains were Islamic terrorists, because, 9/11 happened. Very occasionally, you would see the villains be the Chinese, or some sort of science fiction stand-in for the Chinese. And, by the way, throughout all of this, there were science fiction stand-ins for the other villains as well, like science fiction drug lords, science fiction Soviet officers, but the general idea stays the same. And again, in the aughts, this is when you started to see a shift away from the heroes being intelligence analysts and them just being straight up action heroes and spies and special forces guys and stuff who, it wasn't unheard of for them to think their way out of trouble, but for the most part, they did just kind of shoot their way out or punch their way out. And the villains, again, they were just straight up terrorists most of the time. And it's not that I'm going to defend terrorists, especially not extreme religious terrorists, but they were oftentimes not very realized characters. Like, they were cartoon characters, basically. They were evil just for the sake of being evil. Like, it was like they unironically bought into that line from George Bush, "They hate us for our freedom." Like, that was unironically a lot of villains from this time period in, political thrillers and military sci-fi and just, conservative fiction in general. That was a lot of the villains. However, you can at least say that the villains of this era were actually evil. They were cartoonishly evil, but they were at least evil. They were terrorists. They were despicable people who attacked and killed innocents, and the heroes had to stop them from doing that. And sometimes the heroes would arguably go way overboard with their methodology and everything, but the authors they would usually try to gloss over that and act like, oh no, it's actually fine, and if anything, it's necessary to save the day. But whatever, the main point is that whatever other criticisms you can make, like, yeah, the villains weren't fleshed out characters, there wasn't much of an exploration of how they got to where they are or anything, but you can at least say that, yeah, they're evil. Like, the way that they act in the story is evil, and so the hero stopping them is a good thing. And then you get to the 2010s, and man, there's just nothing redeemable here anymore. Like, it's not uncommon for YouTubers and podcasts to make fun of some of the stuff that came out around this time period. I've done it myself multiple times with stuff like True Allegiance by Ben Shapiro, or The Way of the Shadow Wolves by Steven Seagal, or Trigger Warning by William W. Johnstone and J.A. Johnstone. And by this point, the villains, I don't know how to explain it. Like, again, before this it was terrorists, and usually Islamic terrorists, but sometimes eco-terrorists. And then, if for some reason in the 2010s, they just became, like, politically correct liberal terrorists, because that's what the author saw on the news that day and decided, well, this is a world-ending threat. And I know it might seem like I'm oversimplifying or something, but no, that literally was it in the 2010s. Like, it was just, these people are liberals, they don't like XYZ, and now they're going to murder people over it. And now the heroes, who are, there's no more intelligence analysts out there, they're just special forces guys and cops who shoot their way out of trouble and punch their way out of trouble. Like, there's no more intelligent action or thinking or anything. It's just shooting and punching their way out of trouble. And I don't know a whole lot else to say about it. Like, I brought up Trigger Warning because that's probably the most popular example that exemplifies this extremely well. Honestly, you can watch my video on it where I did a rewrite, or you can watch other people's YouTube videos on it where they go into a lot more detail about exactly how and why that story fails, but that one does exemplify this idea. However, I think what is even more interesting is that most of the time the villains don't actually believe anything. Like, they don't have an actual ideology. The book will come right out and say, yes, they are lying about what they think and how they feel for personal gain. They're cynically exploiting it for personal gain. For example, in True Allegiance by Ben Shapiro, some of the villains are black people who are upset at unarmed black folks getting murdered by police, because Ben Shapiro is terrified of black people. he just is. But it's black people who are upset about that. But the thing is, the main inciting incident for that storyline, at least, is a black kid getting murdered, and the whole thing was staged by a black guy who is, number one, an activist, but also, number two, a drug dealer, because Ben Shapiro's fucking racist as shit. Like, this is what he thinks. Like, he thinks that these black people getting killed by police is just staged to piss people off, and he thinks that it's cynically exploiting them. And I'm saying Ben Shapiro thinks this because I don't think Ben Shapiro is capable of entertaining an idea without actually believing it. And this has probably shifted further, but I'll be honest, I haven't really looked into the more recent stuff that's come out in this decade. It's probably not better. I can't imagine it is. And this is showing how, again, conservatism as an ideology has decayed to essentially being non-existent now. It is just, people are against me, here's why I hate them. Like, there's no more discussion of actual issues in, like, the Soviet economy, like Tom Clancy did. There's no more discussion of, like, why people turn to terrorism. Because, like, in the 90s, it was also somewhat common for eco-terrorists to be a thing, or some sort of equivalent to eco-terrorists to be a thing. Like, I don't think it came out in the 90s, but Empire of Man, the overarching villains are not terrorists, but they are like a weird tree-hugging cult. And the heroes will straight up admit in those cases, yeah, they have a bit of a point, they're just going too far with it. But that's just not a thing anymore. And a lot of times, the villains are only evil in the sense that they oppose the heroes. They oppose the protagonists. Like, beyond that, the book treats them as if they are despicable and evil and monstrous the same way they treated the terrorists back in the 90s and 2000s, but a lot of times they don't have an actual reason to be treated that way. Sometimes they do, but a lot of times they don't. And the thing is, this is why conservatives are so fucking boring. Like, they weren't always this way. I can't say exactly why they turned into this, but they're just so boring. Like, they just have nothing to say anymore. There's a lot of old science fiction books written by people who are fairly conservative, if not just outright fascist, but they're also not necessarily good books, but they've at least stuck around for a couple of decades because, well, they had something to say. You know, Robert Heinlein in Starship Troopers, that's not a good book, and I don't particularly like him as a person, but he had things to say in that book. You know, he had thoughts in his head. Or Frank Herbert, who wrote Dune. Dune's a great book. Frank Herbert was a piece of shit who disowned his gay son and wouldn't even let him visit his mother when she was dying. So, yeah, he's a shitty dad, a shitty person. But in Dune, there were interesting ideas there, and you could see, okay, this guy had a way of looking at the world, and here's him trying to explain it. The overall overarching theme of Dune is that you shouldn't blindly follow charismatic leaders, especially religious charismatic leaders, because ultimately that will lead you down some very dark paths, and the books showcase that extremely well. These guys had something to say. What does Ben Shapiro have to say in True Allegiance? He's scared of black people? Like, there's nothing else there. There's nothing there beyond pure ideology. There's not an actual story where, okay, if you scratch beneath the surface, you can see the deeper themes. And there's not even deeper themes because most of the time they're just so poorly thought out and so self-contradictory and so just mind-numbingly stupid unless you live in the same echo chamber that the author lives in. There's just nothing there. I genuinely think that a lot of conservatives just haven't developed theory of mind, which basically theory of mind is the idea that you understand that other people exist. You know, you understand they have their own thoughts and their own beliefs and their own experiences in their head. And most people figure out that other people are, you know, people by the time we're toddlers. But I think a lot of conservatives genuinely just do not understand that others believe differently than them. Like, they think everyone else who disagrees with them is just lying for personal gain. Again, in True Allegiance, black people aren't actually upset about children being murdered by police. They're just pretending to be upset so that they can gain power. Like, again, I keep bringing that up because it's just such a pure distillation of how Ben Shapiro views the world. Another example of this sort of thing can be found in really shitty, low-budget Christian movies. If you go to watch somebody called The Cinema Snob on YouTube, he has a bunch of videos on these things. Like, he has some on the God's Not Dead movies, but also a bunch of lesser-known ones that you've probably never heard of, like God's Club, or The Trump Prophecy, or things of that nature. You know, he has a bunch of them, and if you just watch through these, you realize, like, okay, yeah, these people are, number one, really bad at making movies, but also just a common theme you see in a lot of them is someone who does not believe in Christianity, but then they immediately start being Christian when they read the Bible. Like, this is what I'm saying. Like, a lot of Christians, oops, sorry, that was bumping against the microphone. A lot of Christians and just conservatives in general really don't seem to understand that people have heard their pitch before and we just don't buy into it. Like, they think that as if you read the Bible, you will instantly take it as pure truth and the absolute, I don't know, pinnacle of everything in the universe. Like, you will instantly, if you read this, you will understand everything about how the world works. And they just think that other people will immediately buy into that if they try reading the Bible. And no, man, it's just a book. But this is a thing, not just in Christian movies, but in real life. A lot of Christians really do believe this. And it probably applies to other religions as well, but I don't have as much experience with them. And most art and media on a fundamental level, whether it's movies or books or whatever else, is trying to show you the world from a different perspective. You know, it's showing you a little bit of something about the human condition, or it's showing you a different way of viewing the world or something. It's not necessarily trying to change your mind, but it is just showing you a little slice of humanity, you know? And if you are unable to understand that different people think differently than you, then you're just dead on arrival. You're not going to be able to make anything that isn't just fucking boring. Like, another example of this sort of thing would be Redemption, the Critical Drinker's book, which I read a couple of months ago. That's mostly just fucking boring. Like, it's bad in a lot of other ways, but largely it's just boring. And a large part of it being boring is just that it says, hey, you're supposed to be impressed by these characters and you're supposed to like them, but it doesn't actually give us a reason why. And that's the thing. Another thing is that a lot of conservatives just straight up don't know why they believe what they believe anymore. Like, they can't interrogate their own beliefs. It's not that they won't, it's that they can't. They can't stop and think, why do I think that way? What evidence is there to support that? Like, they just can't do that anymore. And I know there was a time when they could. Like, again, let's go back to The Hunt for Red October by Tom Clancy. Again, a very good book. There are a lot of parts in that book of one character or another trying to figure out what another person is doing or has done or will do in the future. And so they are like examining their actions and thinking about them and like, okay, if I were in their position, how would I act? But also, they aren't me, so how would they act differently than me? Like, you know, it's literally just someone thinking and taking little bits of information and evidence and trying to connect them together rather than just knowing everything from the beginning, which is also a pretty common thing in conservative books now. Like, I don't know how else to explain it. Like, there's no real investigation. They just sort of know shit from the beginning. But Tom Clancy characters would have to piece evidence together to figure out exactly what's going on, and that goes for both heroes and villains. Again, they are, like, they understand, and Tom Clancy understood, that other people are different than you, and they have their own thoughts, they have their own convictions, their own beliefs, etc. And sometimes things challenge those beliefs, sometimes they change their minds, sometimes they stay the same way. But whatever the case, they do have their own minds, their own thoughts, and conservatives just don't understand that anymore, and that's why all their stuff sucks. That's all. Subscribe and stuff.